it's been recorded because we have people are queuing to get a glimpse of what we are, you know, exploring here.
So today, you go ahead. Maybe you guys lead, and then we can follow what you want to know a little bit more about Norma Living Organization, and also maybe talking about, you know, maybe even get to talking about how we can collaborate.
I think there are two things here. One is to as I wrote, to get a glimpse of all those years of work you, Norman, have been putting into a monster called the Living Organization. I mean it in a positive way. Just to get a glimpse of that, it could be interesting, I think. And yes, and then to touch upon some kind of next step collaboration. So that's the two things that I have in my mind. Yeah, that I'm speaking for myself.
And I'm fully in line with what Tim is saying, and then I'm also, and we also spoke about that last time, just briefly touched upon it in the end, but to get an idea of some concrete consultancy jobs that you've done, so just to give us an idea of how you're working and what is it. Also, I'm curious, I mean, what is it you're looking for in the collaboration with us? So what is it, how are we, how can we contribute? What is it that you are, maybe what are your needs, if that is it, or you want to, so a bit more about your thoughts about that, but also this about examples of concrete.
Lovely. Okay, so I'll summarize it. How did I get here? Number one. Number two, potential ways we could collaborate, which sort of ties into Marianne's last point about what I'm looking for in terms of working with people like you. And three, the some specific examples of how I've used this work in working with clients. So how I got here, that as I look back, it has been a journey that started early in my life. Probably the seeds were planted when I first started working after college, and began to experience firsthand that organizations were not really highly receptive to human beings coming into work. And what I mean by that, I'll give you two examples. One example was my first job, supervisor, I was an engineer, and my senior engineer, so sort of like the group lead. I and two of my co-workers were sitting in the office having lunch, talking about how much we loved our job and how much fun it was and how exciting it was for us. And the senior engineer came in and overheard us, and he very seriously said, I mean, with deep conviction, work is not meant to be fun. If it was fun, you'd pay the company. Work is work. Walked out. I was, I mean, somebody would actually believe that. In the second one, I remember, same company, probably months or a year later, walking around, and some other manager, not one of mine, was making a comment. You leave your emotions at the door. When you come through the threshold, you're here to work. And that probably, was the initial seed of my realization that organizations were not, call it human friendly. That they, I didn't have this kind of language back then, but clearly all the experiences I've had led me to recognize that we were just cogs in the machine, and organizations were machines. Okay. So that was one seeding of my of the path that I was put on. Prior to my working, I had a couple of you might call it spiritual epiphanies, and one was a crisis where I started to question the values I was given as a child growing up. And I had no, and I began to question so deeply that when my mother said, well, you know, that's good, you should be doing that, and start with the 10 Commandments. And I said, well, how can I do that? And she looked at me funny. And I said, well, look, here we are in Vietnam killing people. They didn't attack us. It's not self-defense. I mean, clearly it's not like, and I said, besides, if Hitler walked in and I knew what he was going to do and who he was, and there was a gun on the table, I'd pick it up and shoot him, and I have no qualms about it. So it doesn't say in the 10 Commandments, thou shalt not kill except under these conditions. You know, just
Yeah.
and my poor mother, she didn't know what to do with me at the time. But that kind of set me up again to go into a deeper exploration of what is life about. About a year after that, maybe a year and a half after that, I had an epiphany where, I mean, literally I had like this awakening, and I recognized that all of life was about love. I just had this overwhelming infusion of love, and life became just blissful for about 3 months until I started to work at my first job. And then I had these other experiences I shared. About 4 or 5 years later, after, you know, I was very successful as an engineer, and I got moved from my first job, worked for Hewlett Packard, very successful first 2 years. And I was given this opportunity to become a manager, district manager, first line manager of a service district. And I thought it would be great because I had all this caring and love for people, and, you know, inherent trust and so forth. And I took that into my orientation to management, and I failed my first year. I mean, literally failed. Nothing worked. My first performance review was unacceptable down every line. So here I am struggling with these forces in my life. On one hand, I know everything is love, but it's not good enough to be successful. So what does that mean? And so I began, and then I had this trying to sort through the values, what to believe in. And so I began, and then there was this other desire, this fourth element, you might say, which was, I just wanted to be successful. I mean, I wanted to create the outcomes I set out to create, whether it be on a personal level or on a business level. So these 4 things actually laid the foundation for what my life was all about. And as I began this journey, early on, this value creation journey, I didn't know where to go, and so I set a hypothesis, and as all good scientists do, we establish a hypothesis, a theorem, and then we set out to prove it wrong. And as long as we can't prove it wrong, then there must be some truth to it, right? Never knowing whether it's absolutely true. And the hypothesis I set out was, there is one God, whatever that meant, had no definition for that. If there's one God, there should be one message. And I should see the message of how life works and my role in it, and anything and everything I read about how life works and our role in it. So I began a journey of curiosity and reading. And so you tie all this together, and what happened over the course of my life, successes and failures, 3 marriages, 3 divorces, successes in business, failures in business, and lots of reading. And I began to see certain patterns unfold from this basic thing of looking for what's common in the different disciplines. So whether it be leadership, organization development, spiritual readings, psychological readings, I began to see this notion of everything is energy, and energy cannot be created or destroyed as the framework on which everything holds. So if I look at energy, if I look at some of the spiritual principles that are out there, whether it be Taoism or Judaism with the Kabbalah, the Kabbalah talks about this principle of the Ein Sof and then the tree of life, and Taoism talks about the Tao, and then the Tao splits into two. Well, the tree of life talks about something being up there that is unknowable and infinite and contains everything. Taoism, the Tao is unknowable, infinite, contains everything. And quantum physics talks about a field of infinite potentialities until the wave function is collapsed into a specific event. Oh, wait a minute, there's some parallels going on here, right? And that's what I've done throughout my whole life. That's just one example of the many things I've pulled together. Carl Jung talks about the collective unconscious, and patterns he calls archetypes. Well, if I look at that as energy patterns, again, we see commonalities showing up. In a nutshell, that's how it all came about. Underlying the living organization's model of how life works and our role in it is still the underlying desire of creating outcomes.
No.
How do I get things done? I've always been, and so when I wrote the book with the intention of specifically to a CEO. Now, by this time, let's see, I'm sitting on the board of a public company. I'm coaching the founder and the CEO, dealing with the founder who was CEO is now chairman. The new CEO was president, chief operating officer, and we have this wonderful tension between them. I'm diving deep into spiritual practices and Carl Jung's work. And I'm thinking about all of this and saying, how can I help a leader of an organization understand what's really going on? And recognizing that leaders have to have concreteness about things. They have to have a sense of, look, I'm here to make my organization perform. Everything else is secondary to that. So I said, okay, you want to create results. Here are the energy fields, the forces that make you create results. And you can ignore these forces, but they're operating anyway. So you're probably better off if you know about them. And of course, I described the three forces. There's activity, which is what most people think about. And not only in business and personal life, we think about, when we think about creating something, we always go through the process of what's the plan? What are the steps in the plan? Who's going to do it with me? Let's get going, right? And that's probably the extent of what we think about. And even when we think about who's going to do it with me, we don't think about what the nature of the relationship is. We think about who's going to have what responsibility and who's going to do what. So we still think about it from what I would call the activity field. And I don't diminish the activity field. It's absolutely required. It's sort of like the difference between potential energy and kinetic energy. Until the potential energy moves into motion, into kinetics, nothing happens. So you still need activity. You got to translate something into something. But then there's this, not only the relationships and who's going to be responsible for what, but I've also recognized that over the years, there's this quality of relationship, what you might call the experience of the relationship, both internal and external. Everybody knows, for example, that Apple's computers were never that were never as powerful as the PC. Technologically, the PC always outdid the Mac. But the Mac always outdid the relationship. The experience of working with Apple was just far superior than the experience working with a PC. PC did the job. Mac gave you something else. And Starbucks or any of the now famous coffee houses, you know, you're spending $5 for a cup of coffee, you can go to a convenience store and get for $1.50, right? I mean, I'm not paying for the coffee, I'm paying for something else, right? And in the book, I call that the experiential value of goods. And so this real translation of this. Inside organizations, we know that when teams work well together and have a synergistic effect, there's more to what they can do than if they're just acting like robots, or even worse, being in conflict with each other. So there's something about this quality of relationship that is intuitively, instinctively understood, but we never know what to do with it. And of course, the third field, what I call context, is the underlying core framework of how we see the world. And a lot of people call that culture, but actually I believe culture is something that comes out of context. So context is what's underneath culture and actually creates the culture. And it's actually our core framing, and it's not just the beliefs we have, but it's the stories we make up about how life works and doesn't work. So if you think about it, it's like a filtering system. What's inside my framework is reality, and everything else outside my framework just doesn't exist. But here's the problem. What if the solution I need to my problem lies outside my framing? Now that's where consultants often come in. We come in and we don't have that framework, and we see the obvious that the CEO doesn't see. Why? Because we have a different lens. We are not tied into his particular or her particular framework, right? And so we can see things they can't. And then so I began to realize, like, wow, what if we could teach people that they had a framework, and it both provided meaning to life and it also provided limitations to life. And what if we could teach people how to work with that context field and open it up? There's other things to the context field, but in honoring the time we have. So you can see how the work came out of this lifelong journey of wanting to understand how we create the results we create. How does life work? What our purpose in life is, and how do we create the results we want? And how can we, as a collective, be more effective? I also began to realize that as the thought of a living organization, the book was actually started off being called The Soul of the Corporation. Because I realized that a corporation had a soul. And that's what I wanted to get at when I first started to write the book. Then the book, I actually used the phrase, I did not write the book wrote itself through me, because it had that kind of quality to it. It felt like I was being guided on what I was writing. Every time I thought I was about finished, something else would come through that I had to put down. And so after a while, I just decided, I'm not writing this book. I just get up in the morning and sit at the computer, and it's writing itself through. And one of the notions that I began to realize was that it had a soul because it was actually a living being. And I distinguish between the living systems, which a lot of people are talking about organizations as living systems. And I'm very clear that it's the next step beyond the living system. So a living being is part of a living system cluster, but it's different because it has consciousness. And by consciousness, I mean, we get to decide our context. We choose our context either consciously or unconsciously. So another way to look at context is think of an operating system of any device, right? the operating system of a machine or a computer is the set of instructions that somebody from outside puts in. The operating system of a living system is its genetic coding that evolves over evolutionary generations, right? And so we, as a part of the living system, part of our context field is inherited as part of the species. The other part of it is the stories we make up and give meaning to life. And only living beings do that. Living systems don't. They inherit it, they have a context, and they follow certain principles of living systems, but we have a different, unique capability. So that's one aspect of the living being that I began to realize. The second aspect is living beings are always made up of other living beings. If you look at how nature evolves, single cells join together and they make multi-cell organisms. Those multi-cell organisms join together and make more complex multi-cell organisms until eventually life formed to the human form, which has consciousness. You put living beings called people together into a collective, you got another living being. My wife and I look at our relationship as a living being. We even have a name for him. We decided it was a male. We decided it had a lot of magic to it, and we call him Merlin. And we actually live with the notion that we are here to support the well-being of Merlin. And that changes the way our relationship exists, because it's no longer me versus my wife, which was my previous 3 marriages. Now it's me supporting and giving my soul, my energy to Merlin's well-being. Well, it happens to be when I do that, my wife is part of Merlin, so she becomes healthy, and our overall relationship is healthy. If people in an organization did the same thing, they came to work for the well-being of the collective because they know they are inherently part of it and they choose it, and they get something from the collective by giving something to the collective, we have a different relationship, a different energy field in the organization. The other part, the flip side of that, is when the organization is healthy, all of the living cells are healthy. So I began to realize that working on organizations gives me a huge leverage factor in making people healthy. I can create very healthy organizations, very healthy collectives. All of the cells in the healthy collective are healthy. And so there's a huge transformative factor. So if I was working one-on-one, coaching people, that gives me some leverage, some impact. But if I get one organization to act in a way, then I've got 100 people or 1,000 people, much bigger impact. So that's the short version of the journey to the living organization. In all of this times, so going to the question about how do I use it? So much of this for a long time was embedded in my intuitive and instinctual nature of how I worked with clients. I didn't have a specific set of tools I used. I just went into a client and I evaluated how they're doing in terms of process and the mechanics of running an organization. So they have all the pieces in place. Is the machine well oiled and all the stuff most consultants do. But as I was doing that, I was also paying attention to relationships and understanding its underlying context and seeing where its filters were getting in its own way or its framework. And so as I began, so all my assignments for the last 20, 30 years have always had that part of it, because that's instinctively how I thought and operated. As I wrote the book, I began to give language to what I was doing intuitively. Over the last 7, 8 years, after I discovered that after writing the book, everybody goes, wow, this is really interesting, but I don't know what to do with it. How do I use it? I began to realize there was a big piece missing, which is, how do people use it? So I began a process of what I would call reverse engineering myself. So how did I engage a client? What did I do when I went in there? How did I approach it? And can I translate that into a set of instructions for other people? And the long and short of it, again, to be respectful of time and try to get in as much as I can, what I began to realize was that the tools we have already are fine just the way they are, for the most part. For example, when I go in and I do a strategic plan, and I'll use that as an example because I'm in the process of doing one now, I still do a SWOT analysis. I still do what you might call a visioning process, right? I mean, strategic planning, when you boil it down with all its fancy words and all its fancy ways of going about it, is simply a process of where do I want to go, where am I now, and how do I go from here to there? I mean, it's not anything more complicated than that. And so understanding where I am now, what are my strengths, what are my weaknesses, you know, what's the environment I live in, what's the opportunities might be out there, where my threats come. The SWOT is a perfect tool to do it. But again, remember, most of the thinking is in the activity field. So when I go in and do a SWOT, I actually do a SWOT on activity, relationship, and context. And I begin to articulate. So if you look at our SWOT model, if you will, or strategic planning, what we call our 7-step process, and you look at the worksheets we use, you'll see we have what's the strengths and weaknesses in activity, relationship, and context. And we also recognize that an organization has 3 internal major domains. There's the people. You know, without the people, without the right skills, without the right interpersonal skills, and without the right level of maturity, those 3 things will define how much I can delegate. And so I've got to evaluate the people on the activity, their skills, their capabilities, their interpersonal skills, their relationship, and their maturity or their intrapersonal skills, which is the context, right? So I do a SWOT on the strengths and weaknesses of the people in those 3 domains. I do the same thing with process, and I do the same thing with leadership. How comfortable is a leader trusting his people? That's a maturity issue. How knowledgeable is the leader about basic managing principles, right? Budgeting and setting goals, and right? That's an activity issue. How capable is the leader of dealing with conflict and using conflict as a way of building teams and stimulating that sense of synergy? That's relationship skills. So I evaluate the leadership on those, and I do the same thing with process. And so how do we use the tools? That's an example of whether we're doing an agile implementation, a lean implementation, a self-managing team implementation. One of the things that just came to us the other day, as we've been talking about a lot of our marketing efforts, is I recognize that there are, call it 2, and there might actually be 3 levels of problems that a CEO has. First level of problem is I need to make something in the order of, you know, what I have to get done. I have to make my product development more effective. I need to get my products more tuned into satisfying customers, like I get them out faster with taking too long. So that's the problem he or she is dealing with. They come up with a solution to that problem. Agile, latest, greatest thing. Everybody should have agile development, right? It makes it more customer-centric. It makes, we have our sprints, and we build our Scrum teams, and we have our Scrum Master, and we have our tribes, and we're just going to go implement Agile because that's going to get our products done faster. That's level 1 problem with a level 2 solution. Right? Now, once I start implementing that, then I start running into, well, my people don't really work well together. Now I've got a second level problem, right? And that is the relationship issues. Well, they have relationship issues because they don't have the right maturity to interact with, and they're getting defensive, and they got the ego issues involved, and I can't get past that. So now I've got a level 3 problem. Right? And so what I'm realizing is when we and a lot of other people go out and sell level 2 or level 3 solutions, the CEO is still thinking in terms of level 1 problems, and there's a big disconnect between the two. So people like us go in and talk about culture, change management, people development, and the CEO is still thinking about, that's all well and good, but I got to get my products done faster. Right? And they not, and we don't do a good job of connecting the dots for them. Right? And we know inherently, well, yeah, you got it. We're going to help you get your products out faster. We're going to go do this thing over here. And the CEO is going, but my problem's over here. Well, we'll get there someday. Yeah. And so that's something else I've just realized. We haven't, that's more a marketing challenge of helping them draw the dots. So, you know, and to bring this to the third point of what we're looking for, we, as I said, have and are continuing to develop products like the 7-step process. You can call it the living organization form of strategy. We're developing the living organization form of agile, living organization form of lean. Pick anything you want, and it's, you know, and all we're doing is taking those and transitioning the implementation, so we're making relationship and context explicit parts of the engagement. So we're beginning to learn how to work with and use the forces that are there anyway, in helping the leaders work with all the dynamic forces. We're doing that because one, it gives them something they already know. I'm not trying to sell them something completely new. I'm just expanding and enhancing what's already been accepted and even desired. And ideally, in terms of the kinds of collaborations we're looking for, is people who are like-minded and want to work with transforming businesses and can see the value of our approach being, you know, what I just described, of value to them, because quite frankly, I can't reach the world, and I want to reach the world, so I can't do it by myself. Even if I had millions of dollars to spend hiring people, having, you know, building a major corporation is not necessarily what I want to do. And I don't think in this day and age, it's the right thing to do. I think pulling together more of a community rather than a corporation is the right thing to do. Working with people who have a passion for this, who see what we've done, what I've created, what we continue to create as a team, enhancing what they want to bring, and enables them to achieve their purpose and passion in helping organizations transform. And to the degree we build that community and find those right people, you know, I've built organizations, I've had consultants come in and go. So I know a little bit about how some of the dynamics that are going to happen when we build that community. I mean, one of them, for example, is we're all proud of what we create. So I can't go in and say, well, throw away what you've got and take what we've got, right? We've got to find a way to enhance what you've got. And if you see the value of what we have enhances what you have, then there's a good chance of a good relationship. If not, then let's support each other in different ways, right? So and there's other, you know, I mean, there's a lot of dynamics of, it's like building a marriage. There's all those dynamics that come into play. So, yeah, so that's what I'm after.
Thanks a lot, Norman. It's been really inspiring to listening to you. Really.
Thank you.
Yeah, and just immediate response. I mean, there are so many dots. Yeah, the living organization and a long time ago, like 20 years ago, we talked about, well, it's the soft values and the hard values, and you know, I was traveling around giving speeches about, no, it's the soft values that creates the hard values, and you know, it's very simple, but that was like generation 0 point something way back. But yeah, so a lot of thoughts. So yeah,
one thing I want to add on to that, based on what you just said. I agree with you. I've lived for many years with this hard side, soft side, this polarity, this split. A lot of something inherently built into the living organization model is the fact that there is no split.
Yeah.
It's a dance.
Yeah.
And you need both to create results.
Yeah.
And one of the things Vitaly and I continually struggle with in terms of marketing is, how do we get the message across that it's not hot side, soft side?
Yeah.
It's just creating results.
Yeah.
There is nothing else.
Yeah.
And when we create results in a holistic, comprehensive way, then naturally we bring in the human flourishing and we bring in the soft side, because you can't create without the context, without the relationship, the quality. And so, again, it's all about creating results. One of the things I discovered in my journey, just to sum up, is a lot of what I talk about with people sound like I'm talking about the spiritual path. And when I talk to people on the spiritual path, I listen and they say, yeah, we believe the same thing.
Yeah.
And what I realized is their goal is to create human happiness. And then when I realized that, and I came to, but my goal is always to create results. But the path to each goal is exactly the same. I go, wow, that was like another one of those epiphanies. There is no difference. There is only one path.
Wow. Thank you. What about you? Vitaly, you?
My job, been right from the start, is building community.
Okay.
Particularly on how we communicate these ideas and how we connect with the people on the hardcore side. Not so much the soft, the people soft, they kind of get us pretty easily, but how do we get that into mainstream? So this is why is the language and community building, and now how do we do applications? Right from the start, when I met Norman, I said, Norman, I love your work, but it needs apps. It needs, like, you have a phone, but you have no apps. So you have the operating system, which is phenomenal, but only through apps can we translate it into life.
I like the metaphor you just used, Vitaly. We have the iPhone. We have the inherent instruction set, if you will. But we want to open it up to app developers who want to build their apps on the iPhone. When I think about building community, it's building a living organization, platform-based community of people who either want to use the core apps we're building, want to add to and improve those core apps, or want to build their own apps to go on the iPhone because they see the iPhone as the better platform on which to build their apps. So I like that metaphor a lot, Vitaly. The other part of it is what I talked about. We're really interested in making that linkage from a level 4 solution to a level 1 problem. If we want to impact businesses and want to be adopted by businesses, the leaders of those businesses have to see what we do as solving their level 1 problems, because that's what the board is concerned about. That's what the CEO is concerned about. And all of these other offerings, whether it be culture or purpose statements or strategy or agile or self-managing team, these are solutions to the core problems. And to know how to bring in the right solution at the right time, because there's an interdependence of the different solutions, is critical. And I think that's also part of the living organization operating instructions. How to do that and how to understand that and how to present that is also part of it.